Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for the video cast. Today we're continuing our series examining the patterns of empire in different regions throughout the world. Whereas in Greece and Rome, the patterns seem to be very, very similar between those two in terms of how their empires rose. But then once they establish their empires, their trajectories are very different. In the case of India and China, though, we see some different factors affecting the development of empires there in very different ways. So let's go ahead and get started. It's important to remember that when we talk about South Asian civilization and culture generally, while it had one of the earliest core civilizations in the Indus Valley civilization, it's heavily influenced by the Indo-Europeans who migrated into the region to be known as Aryans. And their life way very different, pastoral nomads living on horses. The exact relationship between the Indus Valley people and the Aryans who migrated in is very much under dispute. I think the best explanation is the two mixed together to form something new. But the pattern politically that the Aryans bring in involves small kingdoms that are sort of unified by their common beliefs in the practices of the Vedas, the so-called Vedic religions that will become sort of the foundation of Hinduism later on. Chief among those, though, is the caste system, which is really two different systems. If you recall, Varna, which is a kind of universal system, that is to say, it's everywhere in South Asia. And this is from the story, if you remember, that different people come from different parts of the body of Purusha, the first person for those who are descendants of them. And if you notice in the caste system, you'll recognize the basic distinctions, the stratifications there. Remember as well, these three are known as twice-born groups because they also go a sort of ritual initiation going from childhood to adulthood. So they're born as children and then they're born again as they reach adulthood. The Shudras, the lower class, does not have such a initiation. And then, of course, the untouchables, who are believed to be not even from the body of Purusha, and consequently, they're sort of separated from that. But it's important to remember, too, there's another aspect to caste, which is jati, which we haven't talked a whole lot about. That is sort of like your profession, and it's your profession, your occupation, your job for your entire family. There is no choosing your job in such a system. It's you are born into it. However, jati is a little different from Varna as well in that it is very local. So like it's based on particular families over time in particular places. So like it's not associated with a particular Varna necessarily, but like your whole family is from this region, and so that's the job that they've always had. But that whole system comes from the Aryans and not apparently from the Indus Valley civilization. Obviously, to the extent that that's going to be a foundational system throughout South Asian history for the rest, the fact that that comes from the Aryans is pretty significant. But again, as I mentioned before, there's the political pattern that forms a basic pattern for South Asia, which is regional kingdoms. On this particular map, all of the capital letters on there are all different kingdoms. And so the basic pattern in South Asia is most of the time they have a bunch of small regional kingdoms, and every once in a while they have a big empire. This is referred to by some historians as intermittent empires, like intermittently. Every once in a while there's a big empire, but the norm is their regional kingdoms. So the bigger question then is, what is it that holds them together? If they're constantly so fragmented, so decentralized into small kingdoms, what keeps them together? Well, the answer is found in that social hierarchy that we know as the Varna in the caste system. But specifically, there's something known as the Laws of Manu. Now, Manu was a Hindu sage, and if you look at this image, you will notice he's got a sort of bluish tint because certain people believe he was an incarnation of the creator god Brahma. We don't know exactly when he lived, but he was known as a very significant teacher because his laws about how Varna affected the way people live with each other were passed down as an oral tradition for literally centuries, possibly millennia. We're not exactly sure, but we do know it's about 200 before the Common Era when they're finally written down, codified. So again, this is part of that tradition of, the oral tradition handing down these ways of thinking eventually become written down, but in this case, not necessarily as a sacred scripture. The basic idea, though, in the Laws of Manu is they outline the roles each person is supposed to play for their caste. And if this sounds familiar, it does, because it's very closely related to the idea of Dharma. And the way that Manu explains how these laws all work together to create social harmony is then adopted by all of the Hindu kingdoms. So what you have is a system where politically it might be very fragmented, but culturally and socially, everybody is essentially practicing the same for a while, unwritten laws about how they're supposed to interact with each other. And that serves as the foundation for South Asian civilization for quite a while. However, there does appear at a certain point a very large empire known as the Mauryan Empire. And if you take a quick look at this map, the green area is where it is at first under Maurya Gupta. And then you'll notice this sort of purple area is extended by his grandson Ashoka. The capital city of this empire is Pataliputra. Notice as well, it does not quite extend to the southern tip of India. And this is going to be a recurrent theme throughout South Asian history. The dynasty was founded by Chandragupta Maurya. Now, I need you to notice this name. Chandragupta is one name. His family name is Maurya. I'll explain why that's significant later on. He is one of those regional kings in the northern part of India. But then he ends up battling a Greco-Persian general named Seleucus. Now, you may or may not recall, Seleucus was the general of Alexander, who after Alexander's death was given that eastern part of Persia. And he conquers some of the other generals to form his bigger and bigger kingdom. And so Seleucus is the general of Alexander, who of course learns about empire from the Persians, who started with Cyrus the Great. So what we have here is this continuing line from Persia to Greece to now India, of what exactly an empire is supposed to be. So in many ways, you could argue that Seleucus sort of transmits the idea of an empire to Chandragupta Maurya, who then goes and conquers other of these regional kingdoms to eventually establish the first large empire in South Asia. Once he's done this, he divides his empire into provinces and then subdivides them into districts for the purposes of administering his power through taxes and law. So it's a really practical sort of system for how to govern all of this. But then in 301, he converts to a brand new religion called Jainism, which is kind of a blend of Hinduism and Buddhism. We'll talk more about that later on. But he totally changes his perspective and just gives up his throne, abdicates his power to his son, who will be in charge very, very briefly. But while Chandragupta Maurya is the ruler of this new empire, his main advisor is this guy, Kautilya. Now, he is a Brahmin, and I don't know if you remember this, but there's a potential problem here. The Brahmin caste is supposed to be above the Kshatriya caste, and as a Kshatriya, the Chandragupta Maurya is from the warrior. So he's the emperor, but he's also technically socially below his advisor. And so you see a kind of conflict, a tension going on there. He's also the teacher of Ashoka, whom we'll talk about in just a moment. He wrote a relatively famous book called the Arthashastra, which is typically translated as the Treatise on Material Gain. But it's the material gain that's the key there. If you're familiar with, in the Western tradition, Machiavelli's The Prince, it's not about spiritual matters at all. It's about how to handle worldly power. And his audience for this is a king and ministers. If you are a person who eventually is going to be in power, here's what you need to understand about controlling power. That's his whole purpose in trying to write this book. His basic idea is this: the biggest problem that you will ever face is anarchy. People are basically bad, and if you leave them to their own devices, they're going to screw things up. And so you need to be a strong single authority. And you need to be willing to apply force when necessary. And some of you might be going, this sounds kind of familiar. It is similar to legalism, although not quite, as we will see, so harsh. So, Kautilya is in this unusual position of the advisor. He's also the teacher for Chandragupta's grandson, Ashoka, who will eventually become the ruler. Remember, the lowercase r before a date. So these are the dates when he was reigning, not his life. These are the dates he's the boss. And he's expanding the empire, as you noticed in the map before. He does a pretty good job of that. But in one particular battle, as he's expanding the empire, it's particularly gruesome, and he converts to Buddhism. He's so troubled by all the pain that he's caused, he decides to dedicate his life to practicing Buddhism. Compassion for all souls. He's basically trying to atone for the harm that he's done. On the other hand, he's still the ruler, and so he builds a pretty extensive road system. He standardizes weights, measures, and especially currency. Coins are now the same all throughout the realm. These seem like pretty easy fixes, but he's got a problem. On the one hand, he is the emperor, and the empire is supposed to expand its territory through conquest. And he knows how to do this because Kautilya taught him how to do this. But on the other hand, he's a Buddhist. And if you remember, part of the idea of how to get to nirvana, the Eightfold Path, is that you have to have a certain way of making a living. And as an emperor, that's a pretty tough way to do it. He's genuinely conflicted by this. And he doesn't necessarily know how he's going to solve this. But one way he tries is by issuing a set of edicts. These are like royal proclamations. They have the effect of law, but they're not quite the same as laws. They're more like policies, but he scatters them all over South Asia, and he writes them in Sanskrit, which is the official language of the government, but also in Greek, because if you remember, the Greek language and culture had spread all the way across the Indus Valley. Aramaic, which, by the way, was the language Jesus spoke. That was the most popular language spoken in the Middle East at the time. In all the local languages, he does this deliberately because he wants everybody to understand what his policies are. Most of these policies, these edicts, were carved into pillars, which we'll look at in just a moment, and then put all over South Asia. Some of them are carved into large rock faces, places where travelers would see them from a distance. And his basic theme in his edicts, though, is religious tolerance. Like, he very much wants everybody to practice whatever spiritual beliefs they like, but because he himself is a Buddhist, he's going to apply Buddhist principles. So it's this very interesting sort of fine line, balancing line that he's going to try to manage here. But in the realm of being a Buddhist himself, he builds these structures called stupas, which are a particular type of Buddhist shrine. So he is like wanting to make people aware of Buddha and his teachings and hoping to convert people, but at the same time tolerating everyone's different spiritual beliefs. So in this map, it's interesting. If you look at the open circles here all throughout the empire, These are the pillar edicts, places where he puts the edicts on pillars, high structures that you could see from a distance. And the triangles are rock faces. This is the interior of a stupa that he built. The the locations are not on this particular map, but he builds them all over the place. And again, it's a type of Buddhist shrine. This is the outside of a stupa, or at least what is left of it. They were these sort of like dome-like structures. They weren't really domes because they didn't have that technology, that archaeological trick that the Romans had figured out. Here, though, you can see is a small pillar. The pillar edicts are usually on ones that are much taller than this. You could see them from a great distance, and that was the point, to call people to come and look at them. So again, Ashoka is trying to find a way to balance political power with Buddhist compassion. And you can make a case it's pretty successful during his lifetime, but after his passing, his successors don't quite have the stuff to keep it together, and the empire quickly folds, and it goes back to regional kingdoms as the norm. And if you notice on the dates here, this is about 500 years. There's several that'll try, like a king will try to conquer somebody and, might, but then it just goes away. There's no real long-lasting empire again in South Asia until we get the Gupta Empire. Now, if you notice this map, first of all, notice the same capital city, Pataliputra. Pataliputra becomes one of the largest cities in the world during the classical era. It's the capital for both the Mauryan and the Gupta empires. And then if you notice these lines, these are tributaries of the empire. In other words, these are kings that are paying tribute to them. Here's the main territory of it. And one of the things that you might notice, first of all, the empire is started by Chandragupta I. Now, here's what I was talking about before. Chandragupta, not Chandragupta Maurya. I know that's kind of confusing, but that's the way it is. One of the things that you might have noticed in the map before, though, is that their empire is smaller than the Mauryan Empire, but the other thing that you might have noticed if you looked at the dates, it lasts longer. So one big comparison between the two, while the Mauryan Empire was bigger, being 500 years before the Gupta Empire, it doesn't last as long. Gupta Empire, not so big, but it lasts longer. It's also known, though, as the Golden Age of India. So, like, in terms of culture, there's most of the things we associate with India happen actually in the Gupta Empire. For example, the revival of Hinduism. After Ashoka, Buddhism, which initially had some popularity in India, it spread outside of South Asia, into East Asia, into Southeast Asia. But in many ways, Hinduism has sort of adapted to that. In some regards, people are viewing the Buddha as an avatar. But in other ways, there's this particular type of devotional Hinduism that people are, again, it's Hinduisms. It's very capable of adapting to things. It's also, in this time, there's a huge trade network that is making the empire very, very rich. And much of that money is used to finance what we call high culture. So like drama and literature and art and architecture and sculpture, things that need funding to perpetuate themselves, definitely happening here. I mentioned the trade before, and if you think about why the Gupta Empire is so successful in trade, think about its location, right? Because one of the things we're going to see, here's the Han Dynasty in China, here's Rome over in the Mediterranean, and the Gupta Empire is right in the middle. They are very much poised to capitalize on that. So the spices that are coming from Southeast Asia that the Romans want, they got to go through the Gupta. The gold and ivory that's coming from Africa and going to pay for all of that, those spices, that's going through India. Cotton coming from India, as we'll see, this is a huge commodity coming from South Asia, going all over the place. trading horses from Arabia for rice and wheat, which of course are hard to grow there. And the biggie is silk. The biggie is silk, which is coming from China and eventually going to make its way all the way to the Mediterranean. So again, they're like right in the heart of all of these. And then that money is used to finance so many cultural achievements, achievements in medicine, many of which are still sort of things that we know. I mentioned drama before. There's a writer, Kalidasa, who is kind of known as the Shakespeare of Asia, which I find a little unfortunate because he was so far before Shakespeare. But amazing literature going on in the time period. Astronomy, way ahead of most of the counterparts in Europe. And mathematics, this is something we're going to come back to, the concept of zero in particular. You don't need to know any of these things individually now. It's just one of the things we're going to see is many of the intellectual achievements that we think are really big deals from other parts of the world, if you trace them back, many of them can be traced back to Gupta India. So if they were so hot, how come they didn't last forever? Well, internal problems like corruption, definitely going to be an issue there. External problems. They've got these people from Central Asia called the White Huns who are constantly attacking them, picking off parts of their empire until their empire gets so small, they're still technically the dynasty in control, but their empire has been whittling away that they're really not considered to be that effective anymore. Eventually they will fall. India breaks up into regional kingdoms again, and they'll stay that way until Dar al-Islam spreads into South Asia, and we get a new kind of state system, a kind of empire. We'll get into that in the future, but here's the big idea, and I'm sure you figured it out. Decentralization is the pattern. Most of the time, there is not a large empire with a centralized ruler. Instead, you have a bunch of regional kingdoms that are united by this cultural and social system around the caste system. But that also sort of explains why they're able to be one of the longest lasting civilizations without such a big empire, because the caste system becomes the glue that keeps South Asia together. Hope you were able to follow along, annotate as you went, and we'll see you in class tomorrow. Thanks for paying attention, guys.